Good afternoon, everybody. Happy September 13. This is a breaking news update on Hurricane Lee, which continues as a Category 3, and I'm trying to figure out my chase plan. Do I head up toward Cape Cod and work some of the winds? Do I head into Nova Scotia, where I think a lot of the worst onshore flow and the surge could happen, including the Bay of Fundy? That does have some of the more significant differences between high and low tide. Likely to be a big time storm surge up there as well. But I've just formulated my chase plan so far. I just got back with Gizmo here and coming up with our new chase plan. We're definitely going to be going live during this coverage. I'll be deploying Surgeonator sensors, of course, as usual. And I do think this is going to bring significant impacts throughout New England and New Brunswick, and also Nova Scotia as well. Just writing this thing up here real quick. We're going to break down the latest European model, latest GFS. We're going to look at some of the steering. We're going to look at the synthetic aperture radar, and that's what you're seeing here. That's a new product, basically satellite derived, but it looks at the ocean surface, and you can see the speed of waves, other different features, detailed features on the ocean surface to basically come up with a wind field. And this has been a pretty awesome feature here as we've been watching Hurricane Lee for many days. Live update: Hurricane Lee threatening New England through Nova Scotia. This weekend. I'll probably have to head up there maybe on Friday, potentially, just deployed that post. So we're going to break down the new European ensembles. And we'll also break down, of course, the synthetic aperture radar. But I want to show you the regular satellite imagery first. And the storm is still a Category 3, still a very healthy storm. But a lot of times when these move this far north in the Atlantic, they start getting this appearance. They get a little bit weaker convection. The cloud tops aren't as vigorous. A lot of times the eye will get pretty large. It'll become what's called an annular hurricane. This one's just a little bit messy as it's lifting off to the north because it's moving over some cooler water left behind by Hurricane Franklin. So when these tropical systems move over the ocean, they'll bring up cooler air from below, or cooler water from below through upwelling. And when that happens, that'll leave a swath of relatively cool sea surface temperatures. And then when another hurricane comes in its wake, it doesn't feed off of as much heat located at the surface of the ocean, and it can even lead it to weaken just a little bit. And I think that's why we didn't really see a resurgence into a Category 5 again. It reached Category 5 status more quickly than anticipated than many of the models were showing. That was last Thursday night, so about a week ago. And I'm going to show you some of the SAR data as it was a little bit stronger, a little bit healthier. But right now, still very healthy winds, especially in that northern eye wall where you get a little bit more vigorous of convection. And if this made landfall in the U.S. like this, it would have absolutely catastrophic impacts, because a lot of times as these hurricanes move north like this and they start interacting with the wind shear of the extratropics, the wind field will dramatically begin to increase in size, and you can still see a nice outflow pattern aloft. Still a nice, well-ventilated hurricane, but you look at satellite, and it even has an eye that's cleared out in a couple of these latest scans. So if you were out there scanning this storm, you'd look up and you'd see that blue sky in the middle of the eye. The northern eye wall definitely seems a lot more intense, but a very symmetric storm right now. Category 3 hurricane lifting off to the north, still a pretty favorable environment to maintain its intensity for a little while. And of course, it has reached peak intensity, but as this storm lifts off to the north toward New England and Nova Scotia, its wind field is going to dramatically expand. So this is a synthetic aperture radar image from yesterday morning, and a lot of these purples and whites are in excess of 100 knots. And you can see it was a little bit stronger 24 hours ago, Tuesday morning on September 12th. A little bit larger of an eye. The eye has constricted just a little bit, but you can see overall the winds, the wind speeds have decreased in the eye wall and the inner core. And we do have this concentric ring out here. You got rings of convection. These are called concentric rings when they kind of will line up like that. That shows that this is going to have a tendency to continue to undergo eye wall replacement cycles. Usually the inner eye will continue to pinch off and get more compact, and then the outer ring of convection will take over. It'll intensify, and then it'll gradually squeeze out the eye on the inside. So definitely when you get those concentric rings, it says that these internal dynamics are at play, the eye wall replacement cycles. 24 hours ago, we lost that look, and you had more of a consolidated inner core, just one eye wall. You didn't have the outer one going just yet, and you can see these little rips in wind speed on the ocean surface in these outer bands. Those are likely supercell storms that are pivoting around the east side of the hurricane. Usually you get a lot more favorable conditions for waterspouts and supercell storms in the eastern half of a tropical cyclone, and especially on the northeastern quadrant. This one's moving off to the north, so the front right quadrant would be up in the northeast. That's usually where you get the more favorable supercell storms. You can see a couple pops in the SAR-derived wind up in that northeastern quadrant. Those are likely supercells, maybe even waterspouts in progress, and you can definitely see some of the enhanced wind with many of those supercell storms, even some of those in the outer bands as you're getting a bit of a dry slot starting to pivot around. But this is pretty awesome data, very high resolution data, and you could look a little bit closer. There's the scale that I have on the bottom, which shows you that that purple and white is in excess of about 100 knots. So maximum sustained winds pretty close to about 120 miles an hour on the north side of the hurricane. But overall, since yesterday, we're starting to get just a little bit of some weakening. And here you can see the SAR data from September 8th when it was a much more powerful hurricane. And you can see that scale. Look at that inner core, very compact eye. But a lot of those winds are off the scale up near Category 4. I believe that was just on the tail end of Category 5 intensity when it started to respond a little bit to the wind shear on the west side of that anticyclone, which it was anchored beneath. And just prior to that, when it was near the center of that anticyclone as a well-ventilated storm, it peaked up to a Category 5 intensity, and that happened in less than 24 hours. But this is a pretty awesome tool to assess the intensity of these hurricanes. A bit of a moat there, too, just outside of that inner eye wall. And you can see the internal eye, the ocean-derived wind in the eye near calm. And so some pretty awesome post-processing has to happen for these. But you can see a absolutely wonderful tool for analyzing the intensity of these storms. And you also have the hurricane hunters that are constantly scanning this tropical cyclone. And that data goes to initialize the hurricane models, and that'll help to shrink the width of the cone. And right now the cone goes all the way from basically the tip of Cape Cod all the way through coastal Maine, and including a large section of western Nova Scotia. But we're going to break down the latest forecast models. We're going to look at that trend that happened yesterday as well. And I do want to show you first the hurricane models before we dig in too deep. This is the operational GFS from 6Z last night, which also has trended a little bit closer to the European model with that wobble back to the west. There is a trough that's leaving the northeast, and it almost leaves this behind. We get a reinvigoration of the east coast trough, and it tries to pull that tropical cyclone back toward the coast. And the European model was the first one to show that happening, and now the GFS is coming a little bit closer. Last night's European model was even bringing Cape Cod potentially in play. If you have a very close passage of a tropical cyclone just to the east of Cape Cod, you're going to get those northerly winds piling up the water in the bay there. And that would lead to big-time flooding areas like Sandwich up toward Provincetown. And near and just to the east of the center is going to have big flooding as well. And there's the Bay of Fundy in western Nova Scotia. And that's a situation there that has extreme tides. There's an extreme difference between the high tide and the low tide. And if this storm comes in during high tide, that would lead to a major storm surge up the Bay of Fundy as this wind field expands. Notice as we're looping over this time, you can see that wind field just dramatically expand. That happens a lot with these hurricanes as they move north into the extratropics. They will, even though their inner core structure will deteriorate, but the overall wind field will expand, and it can actually lead to even worse storm surges a little bit further out from the center of a tropical cyclone like Lee. And so that would mean that the whole entire coastline of Nova Scotia could be at threat of a catastrophic storm surge. And then notice how it tries to follow that diabatic heating max right up through the bay there in between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Could bring some big impacts into Charlottetown up there. in Nova Scotia. But if the European model is right and it's a little bit further west, a lot of these bays out on the southern coast of Maine, Arcadia National Park, could be at risk there, Down East Maine. And I still expect, even with the GFS solution a little bit further out than the European model, that'll still bring those dangerous northerly winds into Cape Cod, unimpeded wind right off the ocean. Provincetown will get absolutely blasted by those big northerly winds. And you can see the offshore flow areas like Portland, if it does take that track. So still depends on the exact forecast track. But even if it does go east of Cape Cod, you're still going to have those northerly winds ripping into those storm surge prone areas out near Sandwich. Chatham will get hammered too. We'll have some onshore flow. Once it moves by, then you'll get those winds shifting to a westerly direction. There you can see some of the precip. Shows you that a lot of these models are showing a little bit more convection on the northwest side of the system, experiencing some of that shear, and naturally that's going to gravitate the center a little bit further west. It'll take that northwestern shift. If it has a lot of the diabatic heating maxima on the northwest of the system, it'll try to propagate in that direction. And you also have that trough, which is exiting the northeast and kind of leaving it behind, but then reinvigorating once again. Here is the 6Z operational European model from last night. And it shows just a little bit further west of a track. The 6Z came back a bit east since the 0Z, but it is still further west of the GFS. And if it does take this very close track out near Cape Cod, that would bring very strong northerly winds into Cape Cod. It'll bring a big time storm surge as well. And if it does hit near the central Maine coast, you'd still get a bad storm surge over the western tip of Nova Scotia all the way to the Bay of Fundy. It would head into the Gulf of Maine, where sea surface temperatures are a little bit cooler, but it really doesn't weaken that much. Still approaches the coastline with about a 965 or 970 minimum central pressure near Maine. And you definitely want to look at the ensemble data first, but I do want to show you some of the steering players here in the northeast. You have a trough that moves a little bit faster off the northeast, and this thing comes in right behind it. But notice how across the once that trough departs off New England, you kind of get a reinvigoration of that trough, and it pulls it back to the west toward the coastline. And both the GFS and the European model are now showing that. That's the European solution, pulling it in a little bit further off to the west, and here is the GFS solution. And it also matters about the size of the tropical cyclone. If we had a smaller tropical cyclone, it would likely curve further right and maybe even rake the southern coastline of Nova Scotia. But we already have a very large tropical cyclone, and that means it'll have a greater likelihood of pulling off to the west. A larger tropical cyclone will lead to more late heat release. You can get a negatively tilted ridge up ahead of it. It'll cause a amplifying trough to gain a bit of a negative tilt over the mid-Atlantic, and that could wrap the system back toward the coastline. So you do have a pretty complex steering pattern out ahead of it. You have this vortex that's going to head right off the coast. There's your tropical cyclone coming in right behind it. And then you get this vortex over the mid-Atlantic that really consolidates and tries to pull it back a little bit further west. And I do think that's probably going to happen, but it could still bring a catastrophic storm surge as it tries to do a boomerang off to the northwest. It would fling that wall of water into the southwest tip of Nova Scotia, and that would lead to a catastrophic storm surge there. A further west track would also lead to a catastrophic storm surge over Cape Cod, Sandwich area. But where you get the offshore flow along coastal Maine, and that includes Portland, areas up toward the central coast of Maine, maybe not quite as bad of a storm surge there, but you can definitely see the complex interaction that plays out here between a trough in the polar front jet stream and a transitioning tropical cyclone that's trying to go extratropical. It's not too terribly dissimilar from Superstorm Sandy, except that happened a little bit later in the seasonal cycle. You had a more potent trough that gained a negative tilt, and it pulled it back to the coastline down near New Jersey, near the mid-Atlantic, a little bit further south, and that brought with it a dangerous storm surge from Superstorm Sandy as well. Here's the latest hurricane models. This is a 12Z models coming in hot. It seems to have lost that bend back to the west. You can see a couple of these. This is probably the European model, which is a little bit further west. But they are clustering near the western tip of Nova Scotia, so a little bit less of a bend off to the northwest. but those models generally don't do as good of a job as the European model and the GFS at kind of factoring in the interaction with the polar front jet stream and approaching trough. But the intensity models just show a gradual weakening as it moves off to the north. It's moving over those relatively cool waters left behind by Hurricane Franklin previously. Does show maybe a little bit of intensification, some of the models, over the next 12 to 24 hours, but then it's just a gradual decrease. And this storm is likely going to be approaching the coastline as a Category 1 hurricane, maybe even a high-end tropical storm. Here's the latest European ensemble data. This is from the wonderful tropicaltidbits.com. And this is the 6Z model ensemble, and it still shows that westward shift. Look at how close that thing is coming towards the tip of Cape Cod, especially a couple of those members. And there still is a decent spread amongst the European model members. You can see a couple of those kind of factor in the positive feedbacks between that trough and a tropical cyclone curving back to the northwest. So you even still have a couple of members that bring it dangerously close to Cape Cod. A majority of those are approaching Down East Maine and the western tip of Nova Scotia. The new 12Z EPS models will be available later on today. We'll be watching it very closely to see if that westward shift continues, or will the windshield wiper effect result, and will we kind of gravitate back toward the GFS model? Some of the experts I've been reading about online definitely are factoring in the size of a tropical cyclone too, and a larger system will be more likely to curve northwest toward Cape Cod, toward even New Hampshire, whereas a smaller tropical cyclone will be more likely to recurve northeast toward Nova Scotia. We'll probably get the average between the two solutions, and I see this thing just coming right up toward Down East Maine, and that'll bring the most dangerous onshore flow into the western tip of Nova Scotia. So I'm seeing kind of a track like this. You'll see that wobble to the west, and then it'll try to head up toward New Brunswick, but that would bring a pretty dangerous storm surge over portions of Down East Maine and the western tip of Nova Scotia. Basically, the entire southern shoreline of Nova Scotia is going to have a pretty dangerous storm surge from this system. You can see the ensemble mean definitely takes the core of that hurricane right into Down East Maine. So I'm trying to decide, do I head into Halifax, or do I head into Cape Cod, or just head into Portland? We're going to be doing coverage for AccuWeather. We're going to be live streaming here again. Thank you, Team Dominator members, as well, for tuning in. Really appreciate all our new Team Dominator members. We do these in-depth analyses. Over the last week, I ended up going to a couple of football games. So I ended up going to the Chiefs-Lions game. And then I ended up going to the OU game, of course, as well. And you can definitely see that thing taking it a little bit closer to New England. That's the European model. Let's change our view, get a little bit closer to the northeast. Oh, there we go. So this is the operational European model from last night from 6Z. And just like the GFS, it shows a lot of the convection on the west side of the system and kind of a dry east side of the hurricane. There it is, a 967 storm. This will be Saturday evening when it's approaching, but the impacts are going to begin much earlier, especially out in Cape Cod. By Saturday morning, with those northerly winds ripping out near the tip of Cape Cod, big storm surge, coastal flooding into Sandwich area out near the tip of Cape Cod. That would be an opportunity to work out there. Some of the flows, some of the hydrology, extreme hydrology off of Cape Cod. In the bay there with those northerly winds. It's all about wind direction with these systems, and that's going to determine just how bad the storm surge will be. Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket will be getting hammered. So by Saturday morning, it's going to be ripping out near the tip of Cape Cod. There's Friday night, and the precip arrives on Friday night near the tip of Cape Cod if you go by the European. And notice that sharp turn off to the northwest that it makes. It'll be interesting to see if the 12Z European model shows that as well. We'll probably end up seeing kind of a balance of these two scenarios. It'll probably head right up toward Down East Maine, curl off a little to the northeast. You also get this big onshore flow over the southwest tip of Nova Scotia all the way out to the Bay of Fundy. And that'll be a big problem as well. Looking at the 850 winds, it definitely shows you a lot stronger 850 winds with a northerly moving hurricane on the east side of the system. So if we did head toward the western tip of Nova Scotia, you'd probably get some bigger winds coming right off the ocean. Here over a large section of southern Maine, including Portland, you'll have largely offshore flow, possibility for some wind damage as well, but a little bit less storm surge flooding. With this track in Down East Maine, you'd likely get a big storm surge out near Arcadia National Park. But really, it's the southwest tip of Nova Scotia that gets hammered here. Some of these bays and inlets, a northerly wind into Cape Cod would also cause some big-time problems. I've seen some of the reports that the swells could even be 30 to 40 feet with that. That's when the hurricane's out over the open ocean, so you're not going to have 40-foot waves just breaching inland and just wreaking havoc out there. They will spread out a little bit. You'll get breakers, but you could get a 6 to 10 foot storm surge anywhere east of the center, especially appearing like southwest Nova Scotia there. Let's look at the GFS model. GFS is real similar to the European model. The 12Z GFS is just a little bit further east, so we're just looking at the 6Z European model. Still bringing that pipe of a jet on the east side of this system. 968 is a low pressure, but it'll still likely be a Category 1 hurricane with this expanding wind field. But you really need that onshore flow coming right off the open Atlantic. Likely to be a significant storm surge over southwestern Nova Scotia. This is Saturday evening at about 8 p.m. local time. A lot of poutine out there over Nova Scotia as well. Record-breaking poutine. Looking at the significant wave height here by the GFS. It shows you some of these waves out near 40 feet on the east side of the system. And look where that heads, right up toward the southwest tip of Nova Scotia. You get a ton of wave action near coastal Maine as well. Big waves coming into Cape Cod. So to me, this is looking like big impacts over the southwestern tip of Nova Scotia. Big waves out there, and you can look at the scale here. Some of those are out near 40 feet. That's the European model, or excuse me, that's the GFS. This is the European. Pretty strong agreement on the intensity of this system. Making landfall is about a 970, maybe sub 970 millibar low, and I still wouldn't be surprised if it curls northeast in between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia once it makes landfall. We can look at our wonderful models here to kind of see how the structure is going to play out. This is the HAFS-A model. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Initialized pretty low with that central pressure this morning as of 12Z. I think we're in the upper 940s right now, but we got to take a look at that as well. But definitely has that strong northern eye wall. Pretty good job with the structure. Dry slot coming in on the southern side, but the more vigorous convection on the northern edge of that eye wall. And it looks like it tries to reinvigorate again through tomorrow and might even intensify a little bit further. Some of the hurricane models were showing that. But then it reaches peak intensity tomorrow and continues to lift north as a very large tropical cyclone. Pressure really doesn't decrease that much. There is quite a bit of warm water. Look at this wind field expansion that happens. When the surface minimum pressure in the middle begins to decrease and it starts to interact with the upper troughs, it's not as compact of a tropical system, but it'll spread out pretty rapidly. And it's remarkable that these models can pick up on this. Notice how the strongest winds are a little bit removed from the center of the storm. You lose its inner core. This is by Friday evening, and you get an expansion of the wind field much further out. And so even if it does come into Maine, and look at that over Cape Cod, you get 50 knot winds right over the tip of the Cape, piling up that water into the bay of Cape Cod. And that's going to lead to dangerous flooding. These areas right here out near Sandwich, you get the northerly flow just piling up that water on the west side of the system. This is on Saturday morning, and that water is going to lead to potentially catastrophic storm surge. I've covered a bunch of nor'easters out in this area, including that one last February near Provincetown, where we had that 100+ mile per hour wind out near Chatham. And Sandwich had the worst of the storm surge. It actually did some structural damage there. And that was as the nor'easter passed just to the east of Cape Cod. Those big northerlies right up into the bay, piling up the water on the northern coastline of Cape Cod, led to a dangerous storm surge. We had big waves out near Provincetown at the tip of Cape Cod. But you need that piling up of the water inside of a bay just like this to get that dangerous storm surge. So I expect those areas out near Sandwich on the northern edge of the Cape are going to have big time problems. And then the threat will shift up toward Nova Scotia, the southwest coastline of Nova Scotia. You have a rapidly expanding wind field. Interestingly, the HAFS model has a lot of the strongest wind between the squeeze play of that trough and the tropical cyclone. Big northerly winds on the west side of it. Hurricane analysis and forecast system here. But then it looks like it tries to reinvigorate the flow on the east side of the hurricane on final approach. And that would bring these strong winds onshore in Nova Scotia. Not as strong on the western side of the hurricane as it passes just off Cape Cod, but still very strong into the southwest coastline of Nova Scotia. Look at that. HAFS model brings it in mid-970s by this time. This would be the middle of the night Saturday, even early Sunday morning. Well, the strongest winds are actually as it passes just off Cape Cod. And it'll bring some of those northerlies on the northwest side of it. And you actually get a pretty weak wind field when it comes into Nova Scotia. Still likely, though, to see some tree damage. Maybe a storm surge out near the Bay of Fundy as well. But any of these inlets on the southwest coastline of Nova Scotia are going to have big-time problems. A little bit further west of the HAFS-B model, a little closer to the European. And look at that, passing just off the tip of Cape Cod, 963 millibar central pressure. Big northerlies whipping around. You can see expansion of the wind field, a weakening of the wind field as it lifts up toward Cape Cod. And that takes it right up toward Down East Maine. And then slides up that bay in between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Take a look at some recon. Looks like the latest flight is en route. This one's in the storm. It's like we sampled about a 950 millibar central pressure. It's fun to watch this recon data here. It definitely nosed out to about 950, so the pressure is beginning to increase. The HAFS-A and B models, as of this morning, do initialize this system as a little bit stronger of a hurricane than what the hurricane hunters are showing. You may remember a few days ago when I was out going to all those games and everything that the hurricane hunters tried to penetrate the eye of a slightly weaker tropical cyclone. This was after it was a Category 5, when it was a little bit weaker and it had an elliptical eye, and they actually had to retreat because there were mesovortices spinning around the inside of the eye wall, and that accelerated some of the winds that were experienced by that. So the hurricane hunters actually weren't able to penetrate the eye during that one time. They were, of course, able to penetrate it during the Category 5, and those incredible videos that we saw during our last live update showing you the lightning inside of the eye wall. You can even see the SAR data does hint at some mesovortices. There's always these tornado-like mesovortices on the inner eye wall of these tropical systems. You can just imagine the speed shear that's happening on the inside of that. Basically, an eye wall is known as a conglomeration of a bunch of supercell storms just stacked against each other. And then it becomes basically this donut. You stack them against each other, they lose their individual identity, they're moving so fast, getting ripped apart, slamming against each other, and it develops that donut-like eye wall. And you can see some of these supercell-like features a little bit removed from the center of the hurricane. Just fascinating stuff. You can also look at the microwave imagery too to get an idea of the internal structure of a hurricane. Definitely shows a lot more of those concentric rings that are happening. Here's the image from September 10th. Showing you a more compact eye. Look at those supercell storms. And you can definitely see that the wind field has expanded over the last 3 days or so using this data. There's the one from September 10, and then you pop on over to the more recent one. And look at that, as the wind field, the inner core might be losing its maximum in terms of the wind. You have a little bit less wind. You still have 100 knots up there in the northern eye wall with that stronger convection. You even get close to 100 knots in gust in the outer ring, the outer concentric ring there. And the system didn't look very good for a while here. This is around September 9 when it started to lose that inner core a little bit. You can see the wind shear begin to affect the hurricane. Looks a lot less symmetric, even though you still have that stronger northern eye wall, a very compact eye. Still a very powerful hurricane here, but you can clearly see an area swinging in on the south side of weaker winds and a little bit less convection, a little bit less in the way of those strong winds mixing down to the surface. Less symmetric of a system too, as it was experiencing some wind shear. (9:52) as of 2 p.m. So that's the latest, factoring in that Hurricane Hunter data. And let's see what the latest forecast track for this shows. Basically shows what a majority of the models indicate as well and are starting to gravitate toward. This is your official National Hurricane Center cone. Still could get tropical storm conditions out in Bermuda with that expanding wind field. And depending on how far west this comes ashore, you could have more issues in Maine. But I do think that the majority of the worst impacts are going to be the southwestern tip of Nova Scotia, the northern coastline of Cape Cod, and maybe portions of Down East Maine. I do think you're going to be a little bit protected, though, in Nova Scotia. You'll probably have some tree damage as well. I really think that southwestern tip of the coastline of Nova Scotia is going to be where the big problems end up happening. Maximum sustained winds at 110 miles an hour. That's come down a little bit as well. Still a powerful hurricane, expanding wind field. Still exhibits the concentric eye walls. We covered that. Saw it in the SAR data. Some dry slots in between those features, leading to a little bit weaker winds mixing down to the surface. The microwave image is the best way to show the structure of the eye walls. Inner eye wall appears to be getting better organized over the last couple of hours. Wind field is held at 100 knots. That's 11 a.m., so it's been decreased since that time. Was a little bit worried about the rental car situation. If we head up from Maine, will we be allowed to dominate in a rental car from Maine and then take it all the way into Canada? I know that when you're chasing in California, you're not supposed to take one down into Mexico. It might even be illegal. But I think you're allowed to get into Canada with rental cars. So I might have to fly into Maine, get a rental car, and head over to Nova Scotia. But you can see some of that cooler water out ahead of the system in waves. That's from Hurricane Franklin that came through a couple of weeks ago, and there's still a little bit of cold water left behind. The ocean surface temperatures change more slowly than the overlying atmosphere. In general, these ocean basins have much higher specific heat capacity than the overlying atmosphere, and that's why sea surface temperatures have some predictability to them when you're analyzing the atmosphere downstream. And you can see this warm NPO. It's definitely retrograded back west toward the coastline of Japan. But you definitely have this warm blob throughout the North Pacific, which should lead to a ridge over the Pacific and eventually force a trough over the western U.S. That could lead to a relatively snowy winter across portions of the Mountain West. You still have leftovers from the last 3 years of La Nina with that PDO or Pacific Decadal oscillation of slightly cooler sea surface temperatures. And then you've got your El Nino and Eastern Pacific El Nino raging out there. I have seen some reports that because the Atlantic is so warm, and that includes the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, that you're getting less of a disrupted Walker circulation and a little bit less in the way of wind shear across the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and portions of the Atlantic, and that's why we've had such an active hurricane season out here. There were definitely aspects of the severe weather season, too, in the central U.S. that still exhibited a little bit of La Nina and a little bit of El Nino hybrid. So I think we had such a strong La Nina during the previous 3 years that we still have this negative PDO horseshoe Pacific Decadal oscillation that, especially during the warm season, as the jet stream lifts up a little bit further north, I think that these anomalies become even more important than those in El Nino, and so which are definitely more important during the transitional seasons and especially the winter when you get the formation of a subtropical jet and it's able to intermodulate with the polar front jet a little bit more. But this Hurricane Lee and Franklin has definitely led to some cooler sea surface temperatures out here over the western Atlantic. But look at that, hugging the coastline up near Nova Scotia, and right along the immediate coastline you get those very warm temperatures up including Nova Scotia, and that could help it maintain its intensity a little bit more, maintain its size, might curl it a little bit further west as well toward New England, but it's probably going to take that forecast track right up toward Nova Scotia. See how everybody's doing in here. Welcome, Team Dominator members. How's it going, everybody? Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This is a live update on the latest with Hurricane Lee. We're going to start doing forecast videos here pretty soon, too. We just like to be in the field so much. We're such a storm-chasing channel, but of course we're experts at forecasting as well, because we have to put ourselves in those good positions to be able to intercept storms. And we have a lot at stake, of course, too, when you're chasing down supercells, tornadoes, and traveling out to these distant locations. It does look like we are getting some drying happening over the west side. You can see the outer ring of convection with this tropical cyclone. You can see the inner ring of convection. That's what we mean by concentric bands of convection. But there is a lot of drying in between those, and you can definitely see it on visible satellite. The most vigorous convection is right along the northern edge of the eye wall. But still a very healthy tropical cyclone finally starting to begin its very slow motion up to the north, and that's going to accelerate. But you've got an anticyclone to the east of it, and this thing is just riding south to north along the western periphery of that anticyclone. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into this live update. Thank you, new Team Dominator members. We are going to be chasing this storm likely. Probably will work the southwestern tip of Nova Scotia, but I still haven't ruled out working the storm surge along the northern coastline of Cape Cod. Probably be up there with Andy Coates once again, AccuWeather. Streaming live here on the Never Stop Chasing Network. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this live update. We do our live forecast analyses here as I'm drinking coffee. And now I'm going to finish my taxes. And then we'll start to make our logistical plans to intercept this storm. We'll probably work the storm surge rather than the inner core of this hurricane. So instead of just trying to record the minimum pressure at the center of it with that expanding wind field and kind of a degradation of the inner core anticipated as these storms kind of move up into the extratropics, I think that the worst surge is going to be a little bit further out from the storm. You may remember that big surge video, I believe it was from last year, that was over the western edge of Newfoundland. That was well removed from the inner core of this hurricane. But when you have a very strong tropical cyclone that's deeper in the subtropics and especially the tropics, usually the strongest storm surge is focused right near the eye wall. So once they make landfall, it's like a tsunami-like arrival of that water. But when you get these storms that are transitioning, wider wind field, usually that storm surge happens a little bit further out from the inner core of the storm. So thank you, everybody. Be sure to dominate that like button if you can. You guys know the drill. And we are in the process of rigging up the Dominator 3 with automated cameras for our research. I'm going to be bringing the storm surge sensors up here from Chase and Spin as well. We're going to be mounting those with flex tape. And looks like we have yet another ripper this season. And the tropical season is not even close to over. You could definitely get big time tropical cyclones in October and November, of course. And some of the long range models are showing the tropics even coming more alive in the long range towards the end of September and October, at the same time as the second season or the fall season really starting to crank as well. I know that there's a big megatrough that might try to punch in to the summertime anticyclone dominating the central U.S. we'll start to look at that as well in future live updates. But thank you everybody for tuning into this weather report. And remember those 3 most important words: never stop chasing.